What Chapter 8 is really all about is solving equations, namely degree 2 equations, quadratic equations. Things of the form ax squared plus bx plus c equals 0. So far what we've done is factoring, and that's where you take something like 2x squared minus x minus 1 equals 0, factor it, and solve. That's all we had to do. Here is x squared minus 16 equals 0. It was the difference of squares, so you rewrote it as a difference of squares and then factored it and solved. The problem tends to be is that 99.9% of real world problems don't factor. They don't. Would be nice if they did, but they don't. That means when you're working with this stuff, there has to be a plan B. And the start of plan B is what we're going to do today, and some of you have already been using it, and that is the square root property. Now the square root property, when you're looking at it, it doesn't have 3 terms. It's got to have the squared term and the constant term. There's no x term. So there's no x term. So if I'm going to use the square root property, essentially it would be something like I would use the difference of squares on. But it would be something where I couldn't use a difference of squares on. So then what do I do? So this would be the plan. So in this case, what would I do? Well, this factors in the difference of squares, but I could say that move the 16 to the other side, x squared equals 16. Now, that says I'm looking for a number such that when I square it, it's equal to 16. But there are 2 such numbers. One is 4, and one is negative 4. So 4 is 16, negative 4 is also 16. This sucker has 2 answers. Well, you did see that when we factored it. It had 2 answers. So that for some of you, when you brought up your pre-homework from 7.7, I think, and what you did is you took the square root of both sides and you only got 1 answer. Well, for 7.7 that was fine. For 8.1 it's not fine, okay? Because there are actually 2. And for some of you, I said, well, we'll take that this time. What it boils down to in theory is this. Remember, we didn't do much with absolute values, but we said if x can be any real number, then the square root of x squared is the absolute value of x. Well, the absolute value of x being the square root of 16, which is 4, again, x could be either 4 or minus 4, because the absolute value of 4 is 4. The absolute value of minus 4 is also 4. So normally this is what we do. And it says we start out with x squared equals 16. I unsquare it by taking the square root of both sides. But because there's going to be 2 answers, I have to say plus or minus. It's either a plus or a minus. So that when you take the square root of 16, you get 4. And so you have plus or minus 4. So x is either 4 or minus 4. So in general, if you have anything squared equaling to some constant, you take the square root of both sides. Don't forget the plus or minus, because it's included. That means that, and I forgot to fix this, that n itself is either the square root, the positive square root, or it is the opposite of the positive square root. You're going to pick up one or the other. Now, if we were doing things like we did in last chapter with the Pythagorean theorem, then my answers are always plus. They're always plus. Why? Because they were always distances. They were always lengths. And we don't have a negative length. Or we don't have a negative distance. So they were always plus. Now we got to take both of them into consideration.